Picture this. You're standing in the inner courtyard of Luoyang's imperial palace in the 6th century, late spring, just before the monsoon heat descends like a weight on every surface. The sandstone tiles are pale and dry beneath your feet. Smoke from sandalwood braziers drifts upward, caught in a breeze that will not cool the skin. And there, framed by pillars carved with dragons and phoenixes, stand the emperor's concubines, silent, still, stripped of their silks. They are waiting for their names to be called, waiting for the coals to glow hot enough, waiting to prove their loyalty with their flesh. This is not a parable. This happened. It was ritual made grotesque, a test of devotion twisted into a theater of pain. If stories like this, of power, silence, and forgotten cruelty, resonate with you, consider subscribing and sharing where in the world you're listening from. These aren't just tales from textbooks. They're echoes. They remind us of what can be done to a human body when no one dares say no. The emperor's name was Xuanwu. He ruled during a time of fragile consolidation, the Northern Wei dynasty, a state forged from conquest and sinicization. It was a court obsessed with appearances, obedience, and balance, between Han traditions and Xianbei origins, between Confucian virtue and military violence. But beneath the rituals and edicts lay something raw and personal. A man raised by suspicion, surrounded by death, and unable to trust love unless it hurt. Historians describe Xuanwu as a devout Buddhist, a pious reformer, a ruler who brought relative peace after decades of turmoil. But scrolls cannot feel heat, and ink does not blister. The women who danced barefoot across fire to earn his favor did not leave written records. Their pain is found only in the footnotes of imperial biographies, and in the uneasy tone of those who copied them centuries later. What drove a sovereign, a man seen as the son of heaven, to demand such suffering from the women closest to him? The answer lies in layers, in fear, in court rivalry, in the void left by a dead empress. But above all, it lies in the shape of the palace itself, a labyrinth of stone and etiquette, where the only safe path was submission, and even that path ended in flame. The palace of Luoyang was no ordinary residence. It was a stage. Every glance, every gesture, every step across a hall was interpreted, recorded, weaponized. There were 900 concubines within its walls, each competing not just for the emperor's attention, but for survival. They lived in compartments of light and shadow, policed by eunuchs, and gossiped about by senior wives. A word from a rival could mean demotion, exile, even death. And so, when consort Zhenhua arrived from the outer provinces, a minor noble's daughter with calloused hands and downcast eyes, she knew better than to speak. She learned to read the room before she entered. She learned to sleep lightly and never dream aloud. Zhenhua's beauty was not the delicate, powdered kind the court favored. Her features were sun-warmed, her voice low, her gait unhurried. But Xuanwu noticed her, at first merely as an object of curiosity, then as a figure of comfort. She asked for nothing, demanded nothing. She merely served. And in a palace of women vying to be seen, invisibility can be intoxicating. Historians speculate that the emperor's obsession with loyalty trials began after the death of Empress Gao. She had ruled the harem with precision, and her sudden collapse during a temple ceremony, some suspect poisoning, left Xuanwu shaken and paranoid. Her rivals, real or imagined, were swiftly removed. Those who remained were subjected to new rituals, ostensibly religious, but unmistakably punitive. Loyalty was no longer something felt. It had to be demonstrated, repeatedly, painfully. The first trial was held during a moonless night. A fire was lit in the central court, and coals were laid in 2 long lines across the flagstones. The chosen women, 7 in number, were told to walk the length barefoot, singing hymns of devotion. No screams, no hesitations. Only those who completed the dance without faltering would be deemed true. Of the 7, 3 collapsed. 1 never walked again. 1 died before dawn. But the emperor smiled that night and ordered the ritual repeated with each season. Always with new participants, always under the guise of purification. It is here that we meet our 3 shadows, not villains, but antagonists shaped by their own wounds. First, Minister Doshan, a man of exceptional mind, born into a family that had survived 5 dynastic purges. He believed in order above all, and saw the harem trials as a form of necessary culling. "A weak court breeds a weak throne," he once wrote. To him, fire was clarity. Those who hesitated deserved to be forgotten. Second, Lady Feyan, senior concubine and cousin of the late Empress Gao. She had ruled the inner palace with calculated charm, her power rooted in alliances, secrets, and fear. She saw Zhenhua's rise as a threat, not for love, but for influence. It was Feyan who whispered names to eunuchs, who arranged for coals to be lit a little earlier, a little hotter. Her cruelty was precise, her motivations entirely rational. And finally, Xuanwu himself, the emperor who prayed daily, fasted often, and once made a monk cry with the depth of his questions. A man who feared betrayal more than war. A man who, despite his title, was helpless against the memory of a dead wife and the growing emptiness of trust. His love for Zhenhua became a mirror, reflecting not her loyalty, but his hunger to be reassured again and again. And when the words were not enough, he turned to fire. This is just the beginning. The summer trials began after the Lotus Festival. The ponds were still, their surfaces scattered with pink petals and dragonflies that clung to them like ornaments. Within the Hall of Harmonious Seasons, the emperor's court moved as one body, silent, elegant, and deeply afraid. No one spoke of the previous trial, not the 5 concubines who had limped for weeks, not the eunuch who dropped the incense bowl and was quietly removed. Even the walls seemed to hold their breath. But everyone knew what was coming. Zhenhua had not yet been summoned. That was the first warning. To be noticed by the emperor and then forgotten was never a blessing. It meant you were being watched. Her quarters were modest, still scented with the oils she applied to soothe the burns left from an earlier ceremony, one where concubines had knelt on heated bronze tiles to recite oaths. Her injuries were faint compared to others. She had learned early how to endure without showing it. But the silence now pressed against her skin like humidity before a storm. Across the courtyard, Lady Feyan prepared herself. She was no longer young, but her beauty remained like lacquered wood, polished, resilient, unwilling to decay. She understood the rhythm of fear better than anyone. It was why she had survived 2 empresses, 3 rebellions, and the slow turning of favor away from her. But Zhenhua was different. Not ambitious, not vocal, just quiet and kind. The sort of danger no one saw until it was too late. Feyan's informants had told her that the emperor had begun visiting the Hall of Jade Bells, where Zhenhua lived, during his meditative walks, that he had ordered a rare ink painting of Avalokiteshvara to be hung near her chambers, that she had not asked for anything in return. This, more than any seduction, terrified her. Because Zhenhua did not play the game, she could not be defeated by it. And so Feyan acted in the only way the palace permitted. She requested a purification rite, invoking old Xianbei traditions, long out of fashion, but still valid in ceremonial law. The rite involved fire walking. It had not been used in over a decade. The request passed through Dusyan's hands. As Minister of Rites, he could have declined it. But Dusyan had grown tired of the harem's dramas and believed fear maintained better order than indulgence. He approved it with one brushstroke and returned to his calendar of court reforms. Later, scholars would question whether Dusyan knew what would unfold, whether Feiyan had whispered something that touched upon his old loyalties to Empress Gao, or whether he simply saw in Zhenhua a destabilizing figure, an untrained consort from the countryside who disrupted the rituals of submission he spent his life preserving. The answer remains elusive, but the ink of his approval was real and irreversible. The trial was set for the 7th day of the 7th month, under the full moon. Officially, it was to honor the weaver girl and the cowherd, two celestial lovers allowed to meet only once a year. But everyone understood it was a trial in disguise. 7 concubines were named, Zhenhua among them. The preparations began 3 days prior. The courtyard stones were washed with vinegar and polished. The fire pit was rebuilt with fresh ironwood and dry bamboo. Coals from the temple hearth were brought in sealed bronze urns. They would be fed slowly, kept at peak heat, arranged in twin paths between copper lanterns. Zhenhua said nothing. She knelt when the summons came, bowed when the instructions were read. She practiced walking with wet cloth under her feet to numb the soles. She took no medicine. Pain, she understood, was the only honest currency here. On the day itself, the emperor watched from behind a veil of gauze. His eyes were shadowed by a crown of pearls, his fingers restless over prayer beads. To outsiders, he appeared serene. But those who had served him long knew the signs of inner turmoil. The way he refused wine, the way he repeated invocations under his breath, even as concubines disrobed and stepped onto fire. Zhenhua was 5th in the line. She saw the first woman slip and burn her hands trying to rise. The second woman screamed too early and was dragged away. The third completed the walk, but fainted before exiting the circle. The fourth bled from the soles, but kept singing. The air was thick with smoke, salt, and ash. Incense burned alongside skin. When her turn came, Zhenhua looked not at the emperor, but at the sky. A single star had broken through the clouds, and she held its image in her mind as she stepped onto the coals. She did not run. She did not falter. She moved like water drawn uphill. Witnesses claimed her silence was the loudest thing that night. Even the fire seemed to quiet for her. When she reached the other side, she did not collapse. She turned, bowed to the emperor, and waited. What happened next is still debated by historians. Some say Xuanwu wept. Others say he left in silence. But what is recorded is this: he did not order another trial for 3 years after that night, and Zhenhua was named noble consort before the season turned. But the fire had only just begun its work. Autumn came to Luoyang not with color, but with cold. The ginkgo trees in the palace courtyards dropped their leaves in pale drifts that reminded the eunuchs of ash. The ponds were drained, the carp taken inside. Everything folded inward, held its breath. Zhenhua now wore robes of golden damask. She had risen, not just in rank, but in visibility. Where once she lingered at the edge of court rituals, she now stood beside the emperor during the mid-autumn sacrifices. Her voice, once unheard, was now the pitch by which others tuned their behavior. But ascension did not mean safety. Those who rise without asking are often treated as if they have stolen something. And Zhenhua, despite her grace, had broken the rhythm of the palace by enduring. She had walked the fire. She had taken nothing, but survived everything. Her body, however, still bore the marks. The soles of her feet were pale and warped. Some nights, she could not sleep unless she soaked them in snow water. The eunuchs who served her did not speak of the ointments or of the bloody cloths burned discreetly before dawn. Even the emperor did not ask, but he noticed. And it is here that we begin to see the deeper wound. Not hers, but his. Xuanwu had grown up in a nest of knives. His mother, Empress Dowager Hu, had executed his rivals with quiet precision. His father, Emperor Xiaowen, had died surrounded by whispers. As a boy, Xuanwu had been taught to pray in one room while executions happened in the next. He learned to smile while counting the number of steps between himself and the nearest sword. So when Zhenhua stood barefoot in fire and did not scream, he did not see devotion. He saw something closer to betrayal, the kind of strength that terrified him. Because if she could survive that, what else could she survive? His mind, like many of his era, was shaped by paradox. As a Buddhist, he abhorred killing. As an emperor, he signed execution warrants with steady hands. He sought enlightenment, but feared disobedience. And in Zhenhua, he saw not only grace, but autonomy. It drew him in, and then it made him furious. He began visiting less. Then came the new rituals. They began subtly. He ordered the concubines to recite sutras while kneeling on grain, a purification exercise. Then came fasts, where those who served him were denied food for days to test their endurance. Next, he demanded cold water ablutions during winter, baths in river-fed basins before dawn. Each ritual was couched in spiritual language, but each bore the unmistakable shape of punishment disguised as devotion. Zhenhua complied. She always did, but her silences grew heavier. The other women watched her with a mix of fear and awe. She had become something unnatural, a consort who did not compete, a favorite who did not flatter. It was around this time that Lady Feiyan struck again. Feiyan had not forgotten the fire walk, nor had she forgiven the emperor for naming Zhenhua noble consort, a title that put her one breath away from empress, a role Feiyan had once been promised and watched slip away. Feiyan had not the emperor's ear, but she had his memory, and so she sent him a scroll. It was a poem allegedly copied from the late Empress Gao's personal collection. A lament written in delicate script, describing betrayal from within the harem, veiled in floral metaphors. It implied that Gao had died not by fate, but by a woman close to her. A willow in disguise, quiet as frost, cruel as fire. The poem was likely apocryphal, but it worked. The emperor's visits to Zhenhua stopped completely. Guards were posted outside her quarters. Her meals were tasted 3 times before reaching her lips. The silks she once wore were replaced with plain white linen, mourning garments in all but name. She was not imprisoned, but she was not free. Minister Docian, meanwhile, watched all this with a scholar's detachment. He had long suspected the court was too soft, too sentimental. In Zhenhua's fall, he saw an opportunity to reassert orthodoxy. He reinstated seasonal rituals that emphasized obedience, created new ranks for concubines that rewarded conformity. He even proposed a return to Xianbei marital customs, polygynous structures where favor rotated like crops, never resting too long on one field. No one mentioned Zhenhua in council, but everyone knew her pain was a bell struck in silence. Inside her quarters, she meditated. She wrote sutras in her own blood. She sang softly to herself when no one listened. Her feet healed slowly, then cracked again in the cold. Her hands stiffened from cold water ablutions. Her face remained composed, until the night she was summoned once more. The note was brief. She was to appear in the winter pavilion alone. No eunuchs, no handmaids, no gifts. Just herself. She bathed. She dressed. She lit her own lantern, and she stepped into the hall where her fate would be sealed. The winter pavilion stood at the northern edge of the palace grounds, where the walls thickened and the light from the central court no longer reached. It was built for seclusion, a place of meditation during snowfalls, a chamber for ghosts, and decisions that could not be made in daylight. Zhenhua entered just before midnight. Inside there were no candles, only a single brazier, glowing red in the gloom. The air was heavy with sandalwood and cold iron. She saw the emperor seated behind a lattice screen, barely visible. He did not rise. He did not speak. Behind him stood two figures, Minister Doxian and Lady Feiyan. What unfolded in that room was not a trial, not a ceremony, and not quite an execution. But it would change the nature of the court forever. What we know comes from fragments, notes scribbled in the margins of eunuch records, temple logs from the following day, and a single anonymous letter found centuries later beneath a collapsed roof tile in the archive tower. They all agree on one point. Zhenhua was asked to dance, not on a stage, not before musicians, but on a bed of embers, laid in a shallow bronze basin. She was not bound. She was not threatened. She was simply told, if her loyalty remained true, she would dance, barefoot as before, and sing a hymn of remembrance. It was not punishment, they said. It was purification. Zhenhua stood still for a long time. No records say what she was thinking. No historian has found her voice, only its absence. But something passed across her face, they say. Not fear, not pain, but something like recognition. Then she removed her shoes and stepped into the fire. This time, she did not walk. She moved as dancers do, slowly, deliberately, with her arms raised in an ancient mudra of offering. The room remained silent. The air shivered. Each step pressed heat into her body until she could no longer feel her limbs. The skin on her feet split open. Blood steamed as it touched the coals. Still, she moved. She sang, barely a whisper, a fragment of a chant the emperor had once recited to her in the garden, a verse about impermanence. What did she see in those final steps? The emperor as a child, alone in a chamber of mirrors, the women who had burned before her, the part of herself that had survived all this and now chose to let go? She collapsed as the hymn ended, but she did not die. When servants entered at dawn, they found her unconscious, her feet burned to bone, her lips still stained with the color of prayer. The emperor had already gone. Feiyan, too. Only Doxian remained, recording notes in a scroll. Zhenhua lingered for 3 days. During that time, no visitors were permitted. A single nun from the Pure Sound Temple was allowed to enter and tend her wounds. It is from this woman that we have our last glimpse of Zhenhua, eyes closed, lips moving in silent sutra, face at peace. On the 3rd day, snow fell. She died just before sunrise. Her body was not buried in the imperial mausoleum. It was cremated at the Pure Sound Temple, as per her whispered request. No rites were held, no names inscribed, but the ash from her fire was carried on the wind. Some say it drifted back into the palace, staining the robes of those who had watched. After her death, the palace changed. The emperor began fasting longer, praying in isolation, refusing to meet the eyes of his concubines. Lady Feiyan, though unpunished, never returned to full favor. She aged quickly and died within a year of a sudden fever. Doxian remained in power, but his later edicts show a marked shift in tone. Less harsh, more uncertain, as though something he once believed had fractured, and the fire trials ceased. They were never formally abolished, but no woman was asked to dance again. The silence, however, endured. Zhenhua's name was erased from official court records within a decade. But in the margins of certain sutras, copied by hand in nunneries across the northern provinces, a new phrase began to appear: "She who walked through flame without hatred." The story did not end with Zhenhua's death. In many ways, it began there, in the hollow that remained, in the palace, in the emperor, in those who had watched and said nothing. Emperor Xuanwu entered a period of seclusion unlike any before. He continued to appear for court rituals, continued to review petitions, continued to perform his duties, but the man beneath the robes was changed. Something vital had gone quiet inside him. According to later analysts, he stopped touching his wives. The inner palace grew still, and the musicians who once played to announce his entrance were dismissed. His food was tasted 4 times instead of 3. He walked the halls of the palace barefoot, even in winter. He began ordering strange constructions, mirrors set into the eaves of empty rooms, tapestries that mimicked river light in hallways never touched by sun. He requested a garden of only white stones, where nothing living was permitted to grow. He said little, but he wrote. Scrolls filled with half-verses, meditations on fire, emptiness, reincarnation. Some survive in temple archives. One reads, "A woman walked where gods would not. I stood behind a screen and called it necessary." Court officials tried to draw him back toward governance. Minister Doxian, still powerful, continued his reforms, streamlining taxes, strengthening the border garrisons, redrawing temple privileges. But a fracture had opened between policy and presence. The emperor issued decrees, but no longer believed in the shape of the court. Doxian grew frustrated. He had not expected guilt from a sovereign. He had not wanted a holy man. He had wanted a ruler who could cleanse the rot and restore Northern Wei to disciplined greatness. But instead, he found himself reporting to a man who now wept during Buddhist rites. Tensions grew. Doxian began consolidating power through the court scribes and military appointments. There is no direct evidence that he planned a coup, but in this period, he drafted 3 emergency edicts, unsigned, that would have placed the state under ministerial control in the event of the emperor's incapacitation. Lady Feiyan, long unsteady after Zhenhua's death, died quietly and without heirs. She left behind no scrolls, no legacy, no protection. The palace forgot her quickly, but the memory of her remained like a stain, the shape of a choice made from fear. The emperor's body, too, began to fail. Whether from grief, asceticism, or poison, historians still debate, he grew thin, listless, and prone to fevers. Physicians were summoned from distant provinces. None succeeded in restoring him. The winter following Zhenhua's death, he collapsed during a ceremony and was carried from the Hall of Heavenly Rites. He did not speak for 6 days. When he recovered, his first act was to commission a reliquary. It was not for a saint or for a known ancestor. It was for Zhenhua. Made of lacquered wood and gold filigree, the reliquary was carved with images of fire, wind, and a woman walking across waves. The emperor claimed it was to house a fragment of her robe, preserved by one of her handmaids, but others say he placed inside it a lock of his own hair, cut in penance. He placed the reliquary in the Pure Sound Temple, where she had died. Not in the main hall, but in a side chamber, unmarked, unnamed. To this day, the chamber exists. Pilgrims call it the Hall of Ashes. They leave offerings there, silk slippers, lotus seeds. incense for the feet of the unseen. The court never acknowledged the reliquary officially, but its existence changed the emperor's relationship with his ministers. Du Xian, once confidant and advisor, now found himself under scrutiny. Whispers began to circulate that the emperor, though passive, had not forgotten who lit the first fire. 2 winters later, Du Xian was exiled on vague charges of excess zeal. He died in transit, his caravan overtaken by a freak snowstorm in the mountains. No posthumous honors were granted. The emperor did not celebrate. He simply resumed his silence. His reign continued for 6 more years. Peaceful, but inward. The borders held. The taxes stabilized. But the court lost its vitality. No new empress was named. The concubines lived like widows. Ministers aged without successors. The inner palace became a cloister. Then, one spring morning, as plum blossoms returned to the temple walls, Xuanwu died in his sleep. Some say he had been fasting for weeks. Others claim he drank a bitter tincture, prepared by monks to purify the soul before death. He was 38 years old. His death marked the end of an era, not just of a reign, but of a certain cruelty disguised as devotion. The fire trials were never revived. In the epilogue, we'll explore the legacy, what this story became in history, and what it means for us now. History is not a mirror. It is a wound that reopens when touched. The story of Emperor Xuanwu and the trial by fire did not vanish, but it changed shape. In official chronicles compiled under later dynasties, especially the Book of Wei, the names are softened, omissions made. The trials are referred to obliquely as ritual purifications or tests of virtue. The reasons for Zhenhua's rise and fall are obscured in passive constructions. She was elevated. She became estranged. She departed. But among temple scrolls, in folk songs sung in villages once tied to the palace grain supply, her name persisted. Zhenhua, the lotus that did not wither, the consort of the ember path. In the north, nuns in certain Buddhist sects began offering prayers for women tried in silence. In the Pure Sound Temple, the Hall of Ashes became a shrine not just for Zhenhua, but for all women who had endured palace rites never written down. The reliquary still rests there. Modern archaeological surveys in the 1990s confirmed the presence of a sealed lacquer box, never opened, embedded in the eastern wall of the chamber. Experts believe it may indeed be Xuanwu's offering. And what of the emperor himself? Later historians, particularly those influenced by Neo-Confucian moral philosophy, treated Xuanwu with guarded admiration. They praised his piety, his commitment to peace, his literary sensibilities. But beneath the praise is an unease, a sense that he was both too gentle and too cruel, too devoted and too broken. His spiritual reforms shaped Buddhist practice for a century. But the fire he lit in the courtyard never quite went out. Today, in academic circles, the firewalk trials are understood as a psychological response to grief and paranoia. Experts like Dr. Liang Shuhua of the Luoyang Historical Institute describe them as ritualized performances of control, using public suffering to repair a personal sense of betrayal. Others, such as Professor Mei Zhang, argue that Xuanwu's behavior reflects the deeper pathology of court isolation. He lived in a palace where truth could not reach him, so he created a new truth, one that required pain to be believable. And what does it mean for us? Perhaps this: in every system where love is measured by pain, where obedience is tested through suffering, where loyalty must be proven again and again, something human is being erased. Zhenhua walked through fire, and it made her visible. But only in burning did the court allow her to exist. She died for a man who could not believe in gentleness, who needed to be hurt in order to trust. And in the end, even he understood what he had destroyed. Her ashes drifted across the stone floors of a palace that no longer stands. But her silence, that terrible, dignified silence, still echoes in the chambers of power, wherever devotion is demanded without compassion, and loyalty is confused with suffering. If this story moved you, if Zhenhua's dance across flame has stayed in your mind, share it. Tell someone. Light a candle. Let her name be spoken again. She deserves that much. Thank you for walking through history with me. Where are you listening from?